Welcome everyone. As of the recording of this video, I've got 5 whole subscribers. Thank you so much. The fact that anyone else likes my videos other than myself is amazing. I hope you enjoyed today's video as well. The concept of magic and fantasy is fueled by creativity and imagination. So why is magic the least magical thing in RPGs nowadays? When playing an RPG, I find myself opting for a warrior or archer type class because from my experience, unless the game is centered around the magic system, if it has one, it will most likely be underwhelming and unimaginative. I can assume it's hard to implement the necessary components for a comprehensive and complex magic system, one that allows more than just casting damage dealing, healing, and shielding spells. When it comes to combat, stabbing someone with a sword is quite straightforward, and to put it bluntly, smashing someone with a club is predictable. But magic is this wondrous thing, seemingly infinite in its possibilities, as evidenced by the continuous scaling back of magic in the Elder Scrolls franchise. It's clear that for one reason or another, developers prefer more simplistic magic systems. Unfortunately, because of this, in some games it feels like it's just an afterthought, a secondary system that doesn't even complement the primary ones appropriately, or one that is introduced because you can't really have a fantasy game without magic. If we look at Skyrim, for example, magic is at its most useful as a combat tool, and even in combat, there is no incentive for creativity. There are little to no organic scenarios in which you are pushed to use magic in a certain way, like preparing and holding a charm spell to cast on a highwayman as soon as they are about to mug you, pulling a giant into a trap where you telekinetically help a boulder tumble down onto it, breaking an oil jar on a mammoth and setting it on fire with a fireball, making it panic and run as it burns, or using a frost spray to freeze the ground under a charging opponent, making them slip and fall. While it does attempt something similar with the intense flames, deep freeze, and disintegrate perks, they are for the most part a kill cam enabler. A system they almost hit the jackpot with is the shouts. I think we can all agree that shouting people off cliffs is some of the most fun you can have in Skyrim. Even if you get a sudden morality check and jump after them to say you're sorry. Nevertheless, you would expect it to be the case since that's what the game is all about, apart from dragons. The Dovahkiin pushrod their way onto the internet when the game first came out, and Bethesda had enough common sense to not mess up one of the most iconic things about Skyrim. The first couple of times that I played Skyrim, I ended up ignoring magic and alchemy, even though they both have combat utility and could have been incorporated into my melee tendencies. On one hand, alchemy and its buffing potions and poisons can be exploited into oblivion, but are otherwise lackluster and the necessary materials are a pain to gather. On the other, magic is less effective unless used exclusively, as your enemy's health is essentially an experience bar for your skills, and if you use 2 of them offensively, the experience they gain is halved on average. Even if you intend to use multiple things by planning something like, I'm going to shoot the enemy with a poison arrow from afar first, and as soon as it gets into melee range, I'm going to finish it off with my sword. When, as soon as you shoot the first arrow, if it doesn't kill the mob, the idiot doesn't even think to take cover. So you just became a stealth archer. Okay. No bows, I guess. I'm going to become an assassin who uses magic to hide themselves until they get an opportunity to plunge their poisonous blade into... Oh, Melee stealth is also busted. No stealth then? You quickly exhaust any potential creative way to play and roleplay. Don't get me wrong, you can limit yourself to certain playstyles in order to use these other systems more, but you're going out of your way and a lot of the time hindering yourself just so you hopefully have some fun as something other than a stealth archer.
I know these self-imposed rules can be annoying, but that's the point of these odd builds, is to make the game different.
The game leaves it up to you and your willingness to create scenarios in which using magic, traps, or poisons is satisfying. However, as I've said before, the issue comes from the lack of intended variety in the way you can deal with encounters. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can look at a game like Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, in which the telekinesis spell allows you to pick up objects of varying weights and move them. It can be used defensively as a distraction, but also offensively, where it technically serves the same purpose as other ranged projectiles like a fireball or an arrow. However, the fun factor is so much higher when you pick up the closest object and magically shove it towards your enemy, causing it to smash into them, knocking them to the ground, and actually dealing substantial damage. Another good example is the freezing spell, through which you can channel your inner Mario Kart player and make an enemy slip off the edge of the map, knocking them all the way to the lowest spot. Death. Not even Lakitu can bring you back from that. And yes, Dark Messiah is much shorter and more concise, so it had less to focus on, allowing it to develop its core systems further. But what is other developers' excuse? If you're creating a game in a fantasy setting, you know you'll have to implement magic unless you explain it away in the plot. So either you allocate the necessary resources to create a compelling system, or you create something passable to check it off the list. And don't get me wrong, there is effort put into magic in Skyrim, from the animations to the effects, the perks, and everything else. But I rarely feel like using it for something other than depleting an enemy's health or preventing them from depleting mine. Giving magic a competent use within and outside of combat isn't even the only way to make it more interesting. What about a game like Magicka, where each spell can be cast in 4 different ways: as a ranged projectile or beam, as an area effect spell, as an enhancement in wielding the player's secondary weapon, or on the player's own body. To cast a spell, the player first sequentially presses the associated buttons for the desired elements in order to gather them. The player then chooses one of the 4 ways to cast the spell using different mouse buttons. This makes the magic in the game extremely involved and fun, but you would hope so since it's the focus of it. I mean, it's in the title. So, like I said, if the focus of the game is the magic, it's probably going to be good. What about something more traditional? A regular RPG that may have technical concerns about implementing a magic system like this. The change doesn't need to be so drastic like in Magicka. Other games have achieved more with less complex and more overdone systems. Kingdom Come Deliverance took the straightforward and limited potential of swinging weapons around at each other and revitalized the trope with directional attacks and feints. The complexity of magic, on the other hand, should be very helpful when it comes to providing many components which a developer can modify. Think of D&D, where spells have different requirements that determine whether you can cast them or not. A material one through something like a spellcasting focus, a verbal one which requires spoken words, or a somatic one which requires gesticulation. Particular motions of the spellcaster's hands. Oh wow, I've just realized Magic could be absolutely amazing in VR. But unless you're looking to have people plug in their mics and worry their parents because they're shouting weird stuff at the screen again, you're left with the somatic component. This has been done before in video games, and it may be done again, which makes me very excited. Watch this clip from the Avowed trailer.
And you must face the monsters our sins have borne.
Did you see that? The character drew a magic symbol in order to cast. Now, it could be a preset animation and only for visuals and flavor, but it might just be something the player has to do. It immediately took me back to a game called Arx Fatalis, in which the magic system requires you to draw different symbols in a specific sequence in real time in order to cast spells. You gradually obtain runes which depict the symbols, unlocking more combinations and therefore more spells. And as I've said, you do this in real time, so while you're able to store a limited number of spells ready for use when needed, the thrill of being mid-combat and having to draw the correct symbols to cast a spell is exhilarating, especially since you may find yourself in a situation that requires you to cast something you didn't prepare. And so, similarly to the way you swing a sword in Kingdom Come Deliverance, the way you cast magic in Arx Fatalis is a lot more involved, which brings a high level of novelty and entertainment to it. Why is it that this way of casting magic hasn't been replicated more? What a shame. I mean, sure, it was a little janky because sometimes it wouldn't recognize the symbol, and that could be deadly during a fight. But we've come so far since then. We've got all these recognition algorithms going on, so I'm sure we can have one trained to make it responsive. I yearn for more memorable magic systems in RPGs, even if they are not perfect. Regardless of whether the spells don't look the best or aren't as flashy, should they allow and incentivize me to use my imagination or ask of me more than to press a couple of buttons, I will be happy. Magic has so much potential, which I hope to see explored more in future video games like Avowed. That trailer got me very excited about the possibility of its system being a fresh reinterpretation. If you're also hopeful and it turns out not to be the case, we can always go back to games like the ones I mentioned in this video because we love when magic is involved and tactile. But for now, talk's over, T.O. out.